Good morning. Welcome to another edition of HR Fridays. My name is Clint, Managing Director of On Demand HR. Today is Friday, the 13th of November, 2020. Apologise for last week. I had an unexpected baby much earlier than we were anticipating. So she's doing very, very well. Thanks very much for your patience. And we had Andrew Kalita filling in for me, just talking through what we've got planned ahead with HR Fridays. But each week we will have a specific topic of interest in the workplace relations, HR or recruitment space, or investigations or business representation space. Let us know any future topics of interest you would like me to present on. Please put any thoughts on today's presentation in the comments, and I'm happy to interact with you about any questions you may have. The whole purpose of HR Fridays each week is to try and provide business, our other professional advisors and associate members advice, which is reality. We've been in the Fair Work Commission many times. We've done many investigations. We've dealt with the Fair Work Ombudsman. We've dealt with other government bodies. We can provide real perspective on your workplace relations affairs, not just theory and scare tactics like some others do. www.ondemandhr.com.au. Today's topic is going to be enterprise bargaining. We're going to continue on with that. You might recall last session I spoke about planning for an enterprise agreement. Today I want to talk about the sorts of logs of claims or union claims that you might get in an enterprise agreement and kind of some of the considerations that you might want to think about when talking through those things. So I'm going to break this down into two sections: monetary claims and non-monetary claims. We can talk about what each types of claims mean and the sort of things to think about when you're considering these sorts of claims. Okay, so we already spoke about in the previous session to make sure that you take time, make sure that you consider the claims, cost the claims, and so on and so forth. This is more getting to the substance of each of the claims and what you should be thinking about in the background. So let's get started. So first of all, the types of claims that we've seen, I'm going to reflect on a few recent EBAs that we've been negotiating on this front and some of the observations of recent claims that unions are putting forward. So the first claim that we get from time to time is that, and this is in the monetary section, is that parity of wages over time. So what you'll often find in an EBA situation is that you might have some employees that are at higher rates than others, and that may be a product of them either being paid above the previous EBA rates, or it may be some sort of historical issue as to why they're being paid higher. So what you sometimes get is these claims that, well, this person's getting this rate, so let's move everyone else up to the highest common denominator. And whilst that might, sound like a morally good cause, and whilst that mindset might sound great in theory, this is sort of an inadvertent way of creating hidden costs for the business when you're considering an enterprise agreement. So the parity of wages argument is one that needs to be looked at very closely before you make any commitments to those sorts of arrangements. Certainly nothing wrong with phasing out rates over time, or grandfathering rates over time, and those sorts of things are a good way of bringing high rates back to parity. But in terms of arguments around increasing the lower rates to meet the top rates that individuals might be getting in a workplace or in a section of the workplace, that can be something that you need to look at very, very closely. Let's also talk about, at the moment, you've got a situation where still obviously wage increases are being sought in EBAs, understandably, and the backdating of those increases. So I think that what we're seeing at the moment is unions understand that obviously the wage increases that they can seek at this particular time in 2020 are probably lower than you would normally seek in a normal environment. So that is, I think that's been recognised certainly in some of the enterprise agreement processes that we've been involved in. But then you've also got the requests to kind of backdate increases. And look, some of those requests might have merit and some of them might not. But the one thing I do say about backdating increases is that you want to create the incentive there for the other side to resolve the enterprise agreement negotiations in a timely manner by giving a kind of unconditional guarantee that you're going to backdate increases. It doesn't really create an environment where the parties are motivated towards bringing the EBA to conclusion. So again, we would suggest that if there's going to be a backdating of increases, it should only be done later on in the piece, and it should be done conditional upon something being delivered by potentially the union and the employees voting on the agreement. So certainly something to think about in regard to that. We've seen recently in a warehousing environment, we've seen requests for allowances for things like forklift allowances. Those are typically not actually outlined in the award. So these are kind of additional things that you might see as being claims for certain allowances in the enterprise agreement. We see requests for things like, and this is across a variety of industries, team leader allowances, supervisor allowances, or even second in charge allowances. Again, this is a way of kind of increasing wages without actually asking for higher percentage increases in the headline yearly wage increases. So sometimes these things can actually add a fair degree of cost, so they should be carefully considered when obviously you're going through the costing process. Paid domestic violence leave is another one that we've seen come up. To be honest, I mean, this has been introduced as a concept for the past couple of years now. It's been something that's been an unpaid entitlement under the Fair Work Act, and it's not something that we've seen that's been used a hell of a lot, the unpaid entitlement. Now, if it were a paid entitlement, would there be more use of it? Potentially. This is a sort of claim that, you might think about. It depends on the circumstances, of course. The other option is to obviously allow a person to use personal leave in these situations. And look, a lot of domestic violence situations end up being personal leave situations anyway, through either physical or kind of mental health issues, or caring for a person in the immediate family or household. So those things I do see going somewhat hand in hand. So that is one way of dealing with requests or claims in respect to paid domestic violence leave. The other one we see commonly is improved redundancy provisions, and this has been something in particular that's been coming up a lot this year because of the prospect of redundancy. Again, we see everything from redundancy scales which are, good, bad, and indifferent. We see some that are, historically very, very high compared to the NES. We see some that are either exactly the NES or slightly above the NES. Again, this is a typical sort of claim that we're seeing commonly come up in recent EBA negotiations. Another one we see is bonus structures inside the EBA. So what we see is a request from unions to put some sort of bonus structure or reward structure inside the EBA, subject to a fairly prescriptive criteria. To be honest, this is not something I'm a big fan of considering. It might sound great in theory, but in practical, what you end up doing by putting it in the enterprise agreement is losing the discretion around how bonuses can be awarded and what types of things or what types of behaviours or performance can be rewarded. And it ends up in the long run being just an additional payment without, a whole great condition attached to it. So again, it's probably something I would resist in an enterprise agreement. Nothing wrong with paying bonuses, but I think those should be discretionary. And I think those bonus style arrangements and the objectives to achieve those bonuses should be reviewed from year to year. So again, I'd probably suggest to organisations that are looking at an enterprise agreement to avoid putting bonus structures inside the EBA. Another request we see often is for paid breaks. So paid breaks, under most modern awards, it's generally a 30-minute to 60-minute unpaid break. And so one way of obviously achieving greater amount of pay for employees in the award is to request paid breaks. Now, that might be practical in some situations. That might be justified in some situations. There are two things to consider on that particular condition, though. One is, will that create an overtime situation at the back end of the day? So if a person works 7.5 hours with an unpaid 30-minute meal break, now all of a sudden that break is paid, is that going to be an 8-hour shift with an overtime, potentially an overtime consideration at the end of it? Or are there going to be alternative provisions in the enterprise agreement to deal with that position of the paid break? So again, that's something to consider very closely. In terms of the payment for paid, or should I say for paid breaks, once again, the second thing to think about as well is the rostering structures, how that's going to work. Is there a justification for the paid break or not, having regard to the work that's being done? If a person's remaining on site or having to remain on site or having to remain on call, there could be more justification for that type of request than one where there's none of those conditions attached. The last but not least, another one we've seen is a request for payment for professional development. So that's the cost of the training and also the time it takes to complete the training. So we've seen that creep into a couple of enterprise agreement claims, and those have been ones that our clients have been considering. So that's a bit about monetary claims, the sorts of claims you might get, how you might respond to them. Again, www.ondemandhr.com.au if you want to talk about those things in more detail, how you might respond to a particular request from the union in any enterprise agreement that you're undertaking. Let's move forward now to the non-monetary claims. So some of the things we've seen this year have been things like a request not to use surveillance except in situations of theft and safety breaches. And I see a lot of companies get really flustered about this. They get flustered about, we're only going to use surveillance if it's a security issue, or if it's if it's something that we have to examine for the purposes of reporting something to the police, or so on and so forth. I don't know why businesses get so worried about using surveillance. If used properly, surveillance is completely legitimate and can be used for a range of reasons, including dealing with performance issues from employees. So again, there are requirements around surveillance that come from the relevant legislation, which we can talk about another day. We won't spend that today, but again, trying to limit the use of surveillance in the enterprise agreement is something that we typically would tell a client to resist. And you certainly want flexibility about how you deal with those things, and they should be dealt with in your policies and procedures of the company. In terms of safety processes, we see sometimes requests for improved safety processes or safety standards. Another one, a more important one we see, is the disciplinary policy. So what we see often requested is putting a disciplinary policy in the enterprise agreement. We, again, would tell most of our clients to resist that, because what often happens is they try and, by putting an enterprise agreement in the enterprise agreement disciplinary processes, the union and the employees may try to limit the discretion that the business has to deal with performance issues, to try and push it through some sort of very long-winded process before you get to a potential termination outcome or something along those lines. So again, something that we would recommend resisting if possible in those situations. Sometimes you get requests for how labour hire should be used. So that can be around things like rates, what's the percentage of labour hire you can use, how quickly they should be converted to ongoing employment. I think some of those things can be looked at in an enterprise agreement. Certainly around the rates, then, maybe you could have an undertaking that you're not going to pay anything less than the enterprise agreement rates for casuals. That might be a fair and reasonable position to put forward. In terms of what percentage of casuals can be used or labour hire employees can be used, I would resist any claims in respect to that. Try and avoid having management decisions being forced upon you by putting those things in the enterprise agreement. The other thing we see is unions requesting that labour hire employees be converted to employees of the company. And I don't have a problem with conversion generally, but I find that's a difficult one to accommodate, because at the end of the day, there's no obligation to convert. There can't be an obligation to convert someone else's employee to be an employee of your company, unless there is some sort of arrangement between the labour hire company and the business that's going to be how it works, and that could trigger some sort of recruitment fee or something like that. So I'd probably resist that sort of claim as well. But certainly you can look at things like rates and have some safeguards in there as a way of dealing with that particular type of claim in response to the union's request. The other thing we see often is a lower time frame for casual conversion. A lot of modern awards talk about a 12-month conversion from casual employment to full-time or part-time employment. Some will request 6 months, and I don't see a particularly big problem with that. If a casual's been there on a regular and systematic basis for 6 months, then do you really need 12 months to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to be full-time or part-time if they're working regular hours? I'd probably prefer to have some flexible part-time provisions in the enterprise agreement if they do become part-time. But that aside, and you can certainly make those things conditional. You could say, well, we'll give you 6 months conversion for casuals, but we want flexible part-time provisions if we do that. So that's a great way of achieving a win-win for the business and the union making that request. Another one we see is sort of non-contact times. This is a kind of a childcare related request where they might seek greater amount of time away from children to do certain planning activities and transition to school types of activities and those sorts of things. So that's another claim we see that comes up in certain EBAs. Additional compassionate leave is another one. So at the moment, it's 2 days per occasion under the National Employment Standards, and sometimes we see a request to use more than that, or that entitlement to be extended. So again, one way you can look at that is consider personal leave, whether a personal leave can be added beyond the use of compassionate leave for those types of situations. Again, bearing in mind that a lot of compassionate leave situations could be otherwise defined as personal leave situations anyway, or carers leave situations anyway. So again, something to consider on that front. In terms of one thing we do see is claims around union rights. So we see things around claims like, and this has been many negotiations I've had over many years, requests for companies to train union delegates to facilitate union deductions. And sometimes you see requests for notice boards and things like that. In terms of the deductions, I think that's fair and reasonable. And I don't see any great reason why you wouldn't want to do that. Certainly through the payroll, it's fair and reasonable to make those deductions and remit that to the union. It just shows a level of cooperation in the negotiations. I'm not sure why resisting that is going to be of any upside to an organisation. In terms of training of delegates, I think that's okay to some extent, but again, I think it should have limits. You've got to ask yourself, well, how many training days are really required for a union delegate to come in and do their job in a relatively small workplace? And not only that, you've got to consider that there is going to be the external support of the union for those employees. So I think that maybe a couple of days a year is okay, but then anything beyond that might be really pushing it and might not be necessary. The last point I just wanted to raise is around the term of the agreement. We've seen mixed messages around this. So we've got some unions that are looking at this saying, okay, well, let's try and lock in a 4-year deal at a reasonably good rate because we think that the next couple of years is going to be very, very uncertain. And we think that getting a solid deal for 4 years is good. Now, rather than the unknown of what might happen in a year or 18 months, particularly if businesses hit the wall with long periods of downtime trading, and particularly if JobKeeper comes off in March 2021, which is going to. The other option is to seek a shorter period of agreement where you seek a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal and then revisit the whole issue of pay increases at that time. So I think there's arguments for and against that. Depends what industry you're in, depends what sort of situation the business is in. And I think there's also arguments for and against on the union side as well. So that's a very interesting one, and not one that I can give a straight answer to or a simple answer to in particular. So yeah, so that's just an overview of, I guess, some non-monetary claims that you're likely to get in an enterprise agreement, and some of the ones that we have seen recently. That's basically it for today. So I hope you've enjoyed this session on monetary and non-monetary logs of claims in an enterprise agreement. If you've got any questions about the session, please reach out to us at www.ondemandhr.com.au. We are experienced enterprise agreement negotiators. We've got a number of enterprise agreements that we've negotiated this year. We've got some that are currently underway. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave it in the chat box, and we'll be happy to revert back to you with some thoughts and comments on how you should approach the situation. But from Clint Indrell, Managing Director of On Demand HR, it's goodbye for now, and have a wonderful weekend.